Hi, I'm Robert Williamson Jr. I am Professor of Religious Studies at Hendrix College and the founding pastor of Mercy Community Church of Little Rock. I'm also the co-host of the Bible Worm podcast and the author of this book, The Forgotten Books of the Bible, Recovering the Five Scrolls for Today. This lecture is the second in a two-part series on the book of Esther. So if you haven't seen the first part of this lecture, I encourage you to go back and watch that before you watch this part, because what I'm doing in this lecture is going to build on what we did last time. As always, you are more than welcome to use these videos for your class or for your book group or just for your own personal use. Whatever way you find it useful, I hope that you will feel free to make good use of them. So, last time we talked about the beginning of the book of Esther. The key points that we need to revisit are simply these. Esther is a Jew who has become the queen of the Persian Empire by entering a contest that the king of Persia, Ahasuerus, had hosted. Esther pleases the king more than all the other women, and she becomes the new queen after Vashti is deposed. Now, Esther is Jewish, but she doesn't tell anyone that she's Jewish. And so as far as anyone knows, Esther is Persian, but she has this kind of secret identity that she has chosen not to share. Now, Esther has a cousin named Mordecai who had raised her, basically as her father, after her parents had died. Mordecai is one of the king's palace guards, and Mordecai, also Jewish, has decided to take a stand, for reasons that are not entirely clear, actually, when Haman, the Agagite, the Amalekite, is elevated to second in command in the Persian Empire. Mordecai decides he's not going to bow down to Haman. And so the other people at the palace guard have called Haman's attention to this refusal of Mordecai to bow down. Haman, in a fit of rage, instead of simply punishing Mordecai, has decided he's going to exterminate the Jewish people. Now, the order has gone out from the king, but really written by Haman, that says, in a year, in the month of Adar, every Persian should go out and kill their Jewish neighbors in their provinces and take their property. And so this is kind of a tense moment, obviously, in the Persian Empire. Now, as the word gets out, all the Jews and Mordecai himself put on sackcloth and ashes, and they go out and they cry in the streets. They raise a protest. They call attention to their situation. But none of them have the ability to sway the king. The person who does have the ability to sway the king is Esther, because she is living inside the palace. But Esther is unaware at first of what's going on. So Mordecai raises a big cry. Esther sends her eunuch down to ask Mordecai, what are you doing? Like, you're making a ruckus. You're going to get us in trouble. And Mordecai tells her the story. Esther says, not allowed to go see the king unless he invites you. And so she's afraid for her life. But Mordecai says, maybe, Esther, it's for a time like this one that you became the queen. Maybe there's a reason you are in the position that you are in. And so Mordecai convinces Esther to go and see the king, which is where we pick up today. Esther, spoiler alert, ends up saving the Jewish people, but it is fascinating to watch the way that she operates. Like Vashti, I think, she refuses to play the king's game. But unlike Vashti, she is very strategic in the way that she deploys her strategy. Vashti simply said, nope, not coming. Esther, as we'll see, really works within the protocols of the Persian Empire. She understands how the palace works. She understands the king's mind. And she understands what motivates Haman. And so she uses all of these things to her advantage in this very careful, very patient, very strategic approach to saving the people. The first step for Esther is simply to get an audience with the king. As she had noted previously, the king has an edict that no one's allowed to come and see him unless the king has called for them. So Esther, when she goes to see the king, is really taking her life in her own hands. She goes to the king, and the options are the king calls her in or the king has her put to death. But when the king sees her, the king is pleased, and he holds out his golden scepter and he invites Esther in. Now, immediately, the king says to Esther, what do you want? What can I do for you? And he says, I'll give you anything, even half the kingdom. Now this, to a lesser person, would seem like an opening, right? If you were trying to save your people and the king said, what do you want? One could simply have said, here, I want you to save my people. But Esther knows that the king's not going to be motivated by that. The king needs a little more incentive. And so what Esther says is, if the king wishes, please come with Haman for a feast that I have prepared. So, instead of asking for something, Esther actually offers something. I would like to honor you, and I would like to honor Haman by having this feast for you. So the thing that you can give to me is the honor of your presence. This is really excellent flattery. It's building up the egos of the king and of Haman. The queen wants the honor of our presence at this feast that she is cooking. Very smart from Esther. So the king calls for Haman and they go and they have the meal that Esther has prepared. After dinner, they're sipping wine and the king says a second time, now what is it you wish? I'll give it to you. What do you want? I'll do anything. I'll even give you half the kingdom. So for the second time, Esther has this offer on the table. I'll give you anything you want. But what she asks for is, again, this is my wish and what I want. If it please the king and if the king wishes, I'd like the king and Haman to come to another feast that I will prepare for them. Tomorrow, I will answer the king's questions. So here's a second feast invitation that Esther has extended, not only to the king, but also to Haman. She is flattering. She is stroking the egos of these men. And especially Haman, flying high now, thinks he's the king's right-hand man. The queen keeps inviting him to dinner. Things could not be going better for him, he thinks. But that is not at all what Esther has in mind. So the king and Haman come for the second banquet. And the king says, this is the second day we've met for wine. What is your wish, Queen Esther? I'll give it to you. And what do you want? I'll do anything, even give you half the kingdom. This is the third time that the king has made this kind of offer. And this time, Esther responds. But I want you to pay attention to the way that Esther responds. She is so careful. She says, if I please the king and if the king wishes, give me my life. So her first move is to make this kind of emotional appeal about herself, who the king loves. And she has been gracious to a fault. And so the king is inclined to be positive towards her. So her first move is, give me my life. Her second move is, and the lives of my people too. The king has actually made two offers. He says, what do you wish and what do you want? And so she comes back and says, this is my wish, that you give me my life, and my desire is that you give me the lives of my people. So she's made this kind of emotional appeal. But Esther knows that the king is not likely to be swayed by a purely emotional argument. So in verse 4, she makes this kind of fiscal maneuver. She says, we've been sold, I and my people, to be wiped out, killed, and destroyed. If we had been sold as male and female slaves, I would have said nothing. But no enemy can compensate the king for this kind of damage. Now notice what she did there. She is making an argument out of the fiscal concern for the king's well-being. What she said is, if all of us, me and my people, were going to be cast into slavery where we could still work and earn money for you, I wouldn't even bother you. But someone wants to kill us, and when we're dead, we can't make money for the king. Who's going to compensate you for this damage? Now the king hears that, right? So emotional plea on the one hand, and then this kind of appeal to the bottom line. Remember that Haman had also appealed to the king's bottom line when he got permission to commit the genocide in the first place. He had said, I'll give you all of this money, 2/3 of the budget of the empire. Now Esther is coming to say, look, if you let this thing happen, then you're going to lose all the money that all of these folks, my people, would have made for you. The king is infuriated, and the king says, who is this person? Where is he? Who would dare to do such a thing? Now, notice that Esther hasn't ever mentioned that this has anything at all to do with Haman. She simply keeps inviting Haman, and by the time Haman sees the trap coming, it's too late. The king is enraged. The king wants to know, who's this that's trying to cost me money? And Esther, it's interesting, even in her response to that question, she kind of sidewinds her way in there. A man who hates, dun dun, an enemy, dun dun. This guy right here, Haman. So by the time she gets around to saying the name Haman, the king is completely worked up. She's appealed to his emotions. She's appealed to his economics. He's appealed to his honor in some ways, a man who hates an enemy. And now she names Haman. Haman is cooked before he even knows what's happening because Esther has been so careful. Now, if you go and look at the story, what you see is, there's kind of a funny little moment there where Haman, the king goes out of the room, he's so mad. Haman grabs Esther around the legs and begs for his life. The king comes back in the room and thinks that Haman is actually molesting Esther, and so he becomes even more enraged, and he demands that Haman be put to death. The eunuchs at that moment say, oh yeah, hey, by the way, there's this big spike in the courtyard that Haman had set up to kill Mordecai. That's convenient. Why don't we just throw Haman on that spike? And so that's what they do. And so Haman dies on the very pole that he had erected on which to murder Mordecai. Haman is executed. Now I want to pause here just for a minute to talk about what I think in this book are 3 modes of resistance. If the question is, in the language of Esther, what do we do when anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism rears its head? What do we do? One could modernize that question, keeping that kind of primary question in mind. What do we do when anti-Jewish sentiment arises? But expand it to say, what do we do when ethnic hatred or ethnic nationalism rears its head? How do we respond? My argument in my book is that the book of Esther gives us 3 modes of resistance. And there may be more in there, but these are 3 that I kind of pulled out. The first is Vashti. Vashti refuses the power of the patriarchy just by saying no. She does it publicly in a way that embarrasses the king. The king calls her to him. The queen sees her moment. The whole empire is watching. And she says, no, I'm not going to obey you. And suddenly people realize the power of the patriarchy is not as given as it had seemed. If Vashti can violate it, so can anybody. And even though a law gets written, like, ideologies like to work in the background. Patriarchy wants you to never notice that there's patriarchy at work, right? Once you have seen it and named it and it has to be put in a law code, then you've got something you can kind of attack. So Vashti, at great personal cost actually, says no, embarrasses the king, and makes a show that people then respond to. The second mode of resistance is Mordecai. Mordecai, we're never told why he refuses to bow down to Haman. My own thought about that is Mordecai knows that there is this kind of anti-Jewish sentiment in the empire. And so what he's trying to do is actually provoke it a little bit, call it out into the light. Now, that's not exactly in the text, but it is suggested by the fact that Mordecai has told Esther already in chapter 2 not to tell anyone she's Jewish, that Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, and that the people who tattle on Mordecai to Haman do it because he's a Jew. So we've got all this kind of evidence in the text that there's this kind of latent anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and Mordecai provokes it. He calls it out into the light. What he is able to do then is to be in the street protesting. He's got his sackcloth and ashes on. He's holding his sign. He's crying out. He's gotten a movement started all over the empire of Jews who are doing the same thing. He is making a scene. He is drawing attention. He is raising consciousness. But Mordecai doesn't actually have the power to change things. So it requires a third mode of resistance in the book, which is the resistance of Esther. Esther is an insider. She's in the palace. She knows the king. She knows Haman. She understands how the government works. She knows how to work the protocols. She knows how to pull all the right strings, push all the right buttons. She knows how to appeal to the king's sense of emotion, to the king's sense of honor, to the king's economic kind of motivation. She understands that if she flatters Haman, he will never understand what she's up to. She knows how all these things work. And so being an insider, being quiet, being patient, working the system, she finally gets things done. And as we'll see, she saves her people. Now, one of the things that I think is important about that in this book is that in our own time, there are oftentimes arguments among people who are trying to resist things like racism and ethnic nationalism about whether it's better to be in the street protesting or whether it's better to be in the halls of power, like trying to advocate for change there. My reading of the book of Esther, and I think it's worth thinking about, is that Esther says all these modes are needed. We need people resisting in whatever way they can resist. We need people to raise consciousness. We need people to expose things that are hidden under the surface. And then we also need people who can make the moves within the official structures to have some solutions. The people protesting in the streets need the people on the inside, but the people on the inside also need the people on the outside. So this kind of fighting back and forth about who's doing it right seems kind of counterproductive. If people can work together, then we can resist such things. I think this line that Mordecai says, maybe it was for a time just like this that you got to the position you're in, we can extrapolate that to all of us, right? In a time of rising ethnic nationalism, rising ethnic hatred, rising racism, what do we do? The one thing to think about is, well, maybe for a time like this is how I got wherever I am. It's how I'm a Bible scholar. It's how I'm a teacher. It's how I'm a doctor. It's how I'm a parent. Whatever it is, what is my role? How did I come to this point? And what can I do from here? That's a question that the book of Esther seems to be raising. Now, we should not forget, though, that the genocide actually has not been called off. All Esther has managed to do at this moment in the text in chapter 7 is get rid of Haman. But the law has already been written, and if you remember, Persian law, at least according to the book of Esther, can never be revoked. Once a law has been made, nothing you can do. It's going to get carried out. So there is still a genocide about to happen in a few months. So Esther takes her life in her hands again, and she goes to the king, and she says, if the king wishes and if I still please him, remember that there is a genocide being planned. How can I bear to watch the terrible evil about to sweep over my people? How can I let others watch destroy my own family? Now, Ahasuerus is kind of over it, right? He's a very mercurial guy, so he was really upset. He got rid of Haman, and now things seem fine. So Esther has to nudge him along yet again. What the king says is, I've given everything to you, and I can't take back a law that has already been made. So you go write a new thing to the Jews, whatever you like. You can write it in the name of the king, sign it with the king's ring, and send it out to them. So just to remind us, this is also what Haman had done when he ordered the genocide, was he wrote it in the name of the king, signed it with the king's seal, sent it out to all the people of Persia. Now the king has said to Esther and to Mordecai, now you can write a command that's going to go to the Jews, written in the king's name, signed with the king's seal, and that will be also a law. So now you've got these kind of opposing laws. So that's what they do. They write the order in the name of the king, and they seal it with the king's seal, and they send it out. In verse 11, the order allowed Jews in each town to join together and defend their lives. So if someone attacks you, you can defend yourself. The Jews were free to wipe out, kill, and destroy every army of any people and province that attacked them. So this is a defensive proclamation. If someone attacks you, you can attack them back. They're also allowed to take and keep anything their attackers owned. So at this moment in the text, what you have is these two orders that are out there. One telling Persian citizens to attack the Jews and loot them. The other telling Jewish citizens that if they are attacked, they can counterattack and loot. Not a good, obviously, situation. Now, if you put yourself in the position of an average Persian, you don't know what's going on, right? Because now there's two orders that are out there, both of them ostensibly written and signed by the king, and they're counterposed to each other. And so what do? Do you attack your your Jewish neighbor like the king ordered, at the risk of being attacked back, or do you not, at the risk of being displeasing the king? So the Jews get together against those who attack them, and the text tells us no one was able to stand in their way because everyone was afraid of the Jews. So the Jews in this defensive posture are able to wipe out all of those who try to attack them. Then we get this note in verse 3. All the leaders of the provinces, rulers, governors, and those in charge of the king's business helped the Jews because they were afraid of Mordecai. Because Mordecai was very important in the palace, news about him was sweeping through the province. Indeed, Mordecai was becoming more and more important every day. Now, what this means, I think, is that the order to exterminate the Jews went out into the province. But the people in the know realized that Mordecai is now in charge. And so they knew not to cross him. So they back off. The elites do. But the common people who don't have access to what's going on the kind of inside of the palace intrigue have no idea what's going on. And so they've got this order from the king. They carry out the order from the king, and the Jews counterattack, wipe them out, and it's this kind of great tragedy. Now, I don't know. It's such a hard thing to parse out, right? So, yeah, I mean, the fact that they were willing to attack their Jewish neighbors means that they deserve some retribution. Absolutely. But the fact that all of the elites who started this thing in the first place were able to escape because they know what's going on kind of secretly behind the scenes, that seems important and often true to the way things happen in our own day and our own time. Elites kind of start things up and then duck out of the way, and common people are left kind of confused, not knowing what they're doing really, and carrying out things that are terrible. Now, the book of Esther officially ends there with this kind of triumph of the Jews over the people who would do them harm, right? Haman has been executed on a pike along with his sons. All the people of the empire who attack the Jews have been counterattacked and wiped out. It's this kind of great victory for the Jews. But if you imagine how this is going to play out, right? Now you've got all these Persians who have been attacked by the Jews, and they are going to now have a festering hatred of the Jews. And so the next time an opportunity comes, they're going to counterattack, and then back and forth it goes. In fact, this is the way that it already has happened prior to the book of Esther, as I alluded to in the last lecture. But Haman, the Agagite, has a history long, long ago. 500 years earlier, in the time of Saul, the first king of Israel. Saul, just as he becomes king, the prophet Samuel says to him in 1 Samuel chapter 15, God wants you to go punish the Amalekites, because the Amalekites are the enemies, which we'll see in a minute. So go attack the Amalekites, put everything that belongs under the ban, that is, kill everyone, kill men and women, children, infants, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys. So Saul goes and he attacks the Amalekites. He captures Agag, the relative of Haman the Agagite, and kills all the people with the sword, but he doesn't kill Agag. He saves some cows to have a nice cookout. And then Samuel comes along and says, "What? You didn't do what I told you to do." Calls Agag forward, and then executes him. So the Israelites in 1 Samuel 15 have actually had a command to exterminate the Amalekites, Haman's ancestors. And in fact, they do kill the vast majority, it seems in the text anyway, of the Amalekites. And they execute Haman, the Agagite's relative, Agag. So Haman maybe is simply carrying out this age-old vindication against people who have murdered his people. Well, but so why were the Jews going to murder, the Israelites going to murder the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15? Well, the reason is because in Exodus chapter 17, if you think about where this comes, the Israelites have just escaped from 430 years of slavery in Egypt in chapter 15. They've just made it out into the wilderness in Exodus 17. Here come the Amalekites for no reason. And they come and they attack the Israelites, this kind of band of escaped slaves, and they come and attack them. This is that kind of famous battle where Moses, when he raises his hands, the Israelites defeat the Amalekites, but when his hands lower, the Amalekites start to defeat the Israelites, and so Moses has to have his hands propped up. Aaron and Hur hold up Moses' hands, and so the Israelites win the battle. At the end of that text, God says to Moses, "Write this as a reminder, I will completely wipe out the memory of Amalek under the sky." So if you trace it back, then Haman's animosity toward Mordecai could be understood as animosity about something that happened 500 years earlier when the Israelites attacked and wiped out the Amalekites. But in the time of Saul, that is a response to 300 years earlier than that, when the Amalekites attacked the Israelites when they were at their weakest coming out of Egypt. And so we've just got this back and forth. Amalek attacks Israel. Israel attacks Amalek. Agag tries to attack Mordecai. The Jews attack the Persians. And so you see this kind of cycle of violence that's developed with no real way out. And so I think the book of Esther, while it does not do this itself, I think the book of Esther invites us to think about how would you actually end the cycle of violence? How would you bring justice in a way that's not simply a counterattack, but how would you bring justice in a way that is about reconciliation, in a way that is about bringing people together, healing old wounds? What does that even look like? I think the book of Esther invites us to think about that, and to think in our own time, all of these age-old animosities of people against other people, these wounds are going to fester, as they did for the Israelites and the Amalekites, until we can figure out how to heal them and do something different. So that's where we'll leave the book of Esther. There's so much in this book that one could talk about, so I hope I've given you some ideas about ways to think about it. If you're looking for me, you can find me at robertwilliamsonjr.com, on Facebook at robertwilliamsonjr.author, Twitter at rwilliamsonjr. Go and listen to the Bible Worm podcast, where we are in the process, as I'm recording this, of also recording some podcasts on Esther for Bible Worm. If you want to get in touch, I'm Robert at robertwilliamsonjr.com. Thanks so much for being here. I hope to see you again soon. Take care.